Black girl cries and begs, please don't harm us. Then her billionaire adoptive father bursts in this. The chandelier shivered as a tiny terrified voice sliced through silk and marble. Please don't hurt us. Beneath the heavy oak, two small forms curled together like whispered secrets. Breath shallow. Hands knotted to hold courage in place. Glass glittered across polished boards, catching light and accusation in the same cruel flash. A woman's perfume of wine and resentment hung in the air while she brandished a wooden spoon like a final verdict. Her voice folded insults into old wounds, each phrase designed to erase warmth and claim the house as a fortress of spite. Jamal's hiccuped sobs trembled against Nia's shoulder while she tried to become a quiet shield, measuring each breath to keep danger distant. The portraits on the walls watched with indifferent polish, their painted smiles offering no refuge. Then measured footsteps cut the tension, precise and inevitable, announcing someone returning from another life into this fractured present. A single name was spoken, low, controlled, full of weight, and the room held its breath as if listening for permission to change. Vanessa's hand faltered, the spoon slipping. For a suspended second, power trembled on the edge of choice. Nia felt something unfamiliar lift inside her ribs. Hope mingled with the raw ache of months that had been ignored. He filled the doorway like a storm, arriving late but decisive. Coat still on, gaze burning with sudden, unsparing clarity. Whatever followed would not be a simple rescue or a seamless pardon. It would pry open secrets, force questions the family had avoided, and expose alliances that many believed permanent. Every witness in that mansion, painted or breathing, would have to reckon with that single hour and decide which truths they would defend. A doorway burst open, a single name landed, tilting fate toward truth, and things would never settle again. Marcus stepped into the kitchen and stopped only when the polished soles of his shoes sounded too loud against the hardwood, like an accusation in a room already full of it. Shards of glass lay scattered on the floor, glittering like small betrayals beneath the chandelier's light. Vanessa stood by the counter, face flushed, hair loose, holding a wooden spoon as if it were a scepter. The faint scent of wine trailed from her and mingled with the sharp copper of broken crystal. Marcus's throat tightened. He crossed the short distance with a steady step and found his voice shaped into a single question, controlled but edged. What is happening here? Vanessa straightened, masking panic with a practiced calm. She smoothed the front of her blouse as if smoothing guilt into fabric and answered with an accusation that had been waiting in her chest. Nia has been acting out, stealing food and undermining my authority with Jamal, she declared. I am trying to keep order in this house. Marcus's gaze flicked to the children. Nia's lips quivered, but she did not speak. Jamal hugged his knees as if a small fortress would protect him from another shout. Marcus crouched so he could look each child in the eye, letting his presence be both question and promise. When he rose, he did not look to Vanessa with the same curiosity. Instead, his tone hardened into a precise, low clarity. I heard the words, he said. I stood outside that kitchen door for a minute. You called her dirty and told her she did not belong here. For a moment, Vanessa attempted to shrink the moment, to make it appear as a slip of temper or the consequence of too much wine. It was a foolish thing to say, she murmured, but contrition did not carry conviction. The syllables sounded like a line rehearsed for convenience. Marcus let that explanation fall away. His hands rested on his knees as if bracing to lift the children out of fear. You are my daughter, he told Nia. The sentence issued with the gravity of a formal vow. Always, the words landed like a promise that could not be easily eroded. Vanessa moved to reclaim authority through outrage. You are tired, Marcus. This is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, she protested, the tone crafted to solicit leniency. You do not have to, she began, but Marcus cut her off, measured and final. No, you terrorized a child in my home. Pack your things. You are no longer welcome here. Silence fell after his declaration, a stunned hush that felt less like relief and more like the space after a verdict. Nia's cheeks gleamed with unshed tears. Jamal pressed his face into the shadow beneath the table, breathing shallow to muffled trembling. Vanessa gathered herself with the speed of someone for whom saving face was a habit. She stuffed a few garments into an expensive suitcase, moving with the smooth efficiency of practiced exit. She glanced at framed photographs on the mantel where staged smiles had once testified to calm. Those images now read as brittle props in a play that had suddenly collapsed. Marcus watched her go without theatrics, but his attention measured each step she took away from the family. He instructed a house manager to prepare a car and told staff to await further instructions. Even as he activated practical responses, guilt pressed at him, the slow, heavy kind that arrives when a parent realizes absence allowed harm to flourish. He had thought distance might be protection. Instead, it had created a vacuum where cruelty could take root. At the foyer, Vanessa hesitated, as if tempted to return and shape the story with one last spiteful line. Marcus did not block the door. He understood that banishment would not erase the damage and that someone accustomed to private venom might not disappear without attempting to rewrite the narrative. He ordered locks changed and surveillance increased, simple yet necessary measures to keep an immediate danger at bay. He led the children to a quieter suite in the east wing, where sunlight filtered through heavy curtains and softened the edges of the day's shop. Nia moved with a cautious steadiness, the way someone learns to walk a new path after a misstep. Jamal clutched Marcus's sleeve and inhaled the steady rhythm of another adult's heartbeat, as though it could replace the rhythm that had previously kept him alert for danger. Marcus made a series of calls: a friend in law enforcement, an attorney versed in family matters, and a trusted caseworker who could advise on next steps. He spoke in clipped sentences: evidence, documentation, immediate protection, then sat across from the children and let them set the pace for what to say and what to shelter. He prioritized their comfort over any desire to craft an immediate public account. First, safety, then clarity. Professionals arrived in careful succession, gentle with the children and efficient in their tasks. A caseworker offered crayons in a quiet corner where Nia could speak without interruption. When she described the insults and the small humiliations that had become routine, she did so without flourish. Facts, simple and clear. The worker translated those halting sentences into a record capable of protecting the family in the hours ahead. Marcus handed over house camera footage and a clipped phone recording in which Vanessa's voice was harsh and unambiguous. Evidence took shape, patterns of denigration and control that matched the children's account. Officials outlined immediate remedies, temporary accommodations, counseling referrals, protective orders, and wrote each item down as if that act itself could steady a wobbling life. As the afternoon rounded toward evening and clouds gathered beyond the windows, the mansion seemed to shrink into a narrower, more honest space. There would be consequences that extended beyond these rooms: legal filings, questions from school administrators, the idle curiosity of neighbors. But silence was no refuge for a child. Marcus resolved to manage both the practical and the tender, legal safeguards alongside everyday presence that would slowly rebuild trust. That evening he made tea and sat at a small table with Neo while Jamal dozed on a sofa exhausted. She named the harmless comforts she had clung to: a favorite crayon, a bedtime story, a melody that made her hum. And when she returned to the kitchen moment, she spoke plainly, without embellishment. Marcus listened, apologized in ways children could grasp, and made promises he intended to keep: consistent dinners, school drop-offs, a presence that turned absence into a harder choice. Outside, the first raindrops began to tap the window pane. Inside, decisions were taking shape and actions were unfolding to hold those decisions. Marcus checked the locks once more, then sat with the children until breathing slowed and a fragile sleep came. In the quiet that followed, he rehearsed the necessary conversations: lawyers, school officials, close friends, not from vanity but from duty. The moment had cracked open a life that had been arranged around images, and for the first time in a long while he felt certain of where his loyalties belonged. Vanessa stood motionless, fingertips white where they dug into the kitchen island, breath quick and shallow as if the air itself resisted her. "You're serious?" she breathed, voice breaking like porcelain. Marcus offered no response beyond a stillness that served as judgment. His silence formed a wall she could not surmount. Without another argument, she scooped a garbage bag Marcus had tossed toward the door, slung it over her shoulder, and left in a rush that sounded like the closing of an old chapter. Marcus guided Nia and Jamal up the staircase with steady, unhurried steps, each footfall soft against polished wood. They moved past the locked study where secrets had been kept, past wedding portraits that suddenly read as contrived props, and into the master bedroom where he flipped on a lamp and made the space warm and usable rather than staged. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said gently. "With me." His voice had the plain authority of someone who had decided an action needed to be carried through. At the threshold, Nia hesitated, the question forming as if unsure whether asking might dissolve the new promise. "Will you send me back?" she murmured. Marcus crouched so their eyes met and listened with the kind of attention that mends fragile edges. "No one's sending you anywhere," he replied, the sentence simple and absolute. "I signed those papers with my soul. Your mom." Saying it aloud turned a legal formality into a vow. His words settled like a steadying hand on a child's shoulder. Jamal clung to the hem of Marcus's coat, knuckles whitening. "Why didn't you come sooner?" he asked, voice muffled by fear and longing. Marcus's jaw drew taut, regret passed over his face like a shadow. "I thought you were safe," he confessed. I was wrong. The admission was small and true, its honesty clearing space for repair. The front door slammed with a finality that made the house inhale. Vanessa was gone for now, but absence did not equal safety, and Marcus knew it. He spent the night reviewing surveillance footage, replaying moments that had once seemed unremarkable until context revealed harm. A clip from earlier showed Vanessa closing a closet door with Nia inside, her whisper a command, "You eat when I say." Watching the frame made Marcus's hands shake, not with immediate fury but with shame for time lost. In the first gray hours, he called Detective Lena Carter, someone who knew how to turn domestic fear into actionable steps. "I need a welfare report," he said, measured and earnest. "My ex crossed a line." Lena's voice stayed steady as she outlined immediate safeguards and promised to coordinate with appropriate services. When Child Protective Services arrived the next morning, they brought efficiency tempered with care. Thompson, the caseworker, had a calm manner that eased nervous edges and encouraged small truths to surface. She sat with Nia in a quiet room away from flourishes and cameras, offering crayons and a plush toy while questions came in palate-cleansed syllables. Nia's hands twisted the toy's ear as she spoke, choosing words with the careful economy of someone trained by fear to minimize. "She called me names," Nia whispered at last. "Said I wasn't wanted because I'm black." The confession landed with an almost audible gravity. Thompson's pen moved quickly to capture specifics. Notes would become a protective ledger that officials and courts could rely on. "Did this happen often?" the worker asked, in a voice that neither judged nor startled. "Almost every day," Nia answered, the cadence steady despite the memories surging behind each clause. Marcus watched from the doorway as the caseworker translated a child's halting account into official language. He felt the familiar sting of paternal failure, moments when distance was mistaken for trust, and delegation disguised as avoidance. He handed over copies of the footage and provided a recording in which Vanessa's voice was unambiguous and cruel. Evidence congealed into a narrative that could be presented to authorities. Patterns of belittlement, episodes of withheld food, scenes of intimidation meant to silence. They made a list of immediate measures. Locks would be changed, staff reassigned, and protective orders drafted. Counseling referrals were arranged for the children, and a short-term plan emphasized Marcus's consistent presence at meals and bedtime, while professionals managed the legal steps. The list of tasks, mundane and procedural, afforded him a channel for grief. Action displaced the vertigo of guilt. Neighborhood whispers began to collect like dust, as word leaked to those on the perimeter of their world. Marcus issued terse statements through counsel, prioritizing privacy and the children's well-being over any desire for public absolution. He suspected Vanessa would enlist allies to craft a counter-narrative, but for now his focus remained inward: stability first, optics second. Medical professionals later confirmed injuries consistent with Nia's description. The doctor recorded bruises and notes that would bolster the protective case. With clinical confirmation, the documentary skeleton of proof became sturdier. Camera clips, professional observations, and the child's testimony combined to make a case not easily dismissed. Yet paperwork did not heal small bodies overnight. Healing lived in routine. Marcus sat on the edge of a bed and read stories until Nia's eyes fluttered closed. He learned the simple choreography of caregiving: steady breakfasts, consistent goodnight rituals, small acknowledgments that validated feelings rather than diminishing them. These acts accreted trust like barnacles, slow and stubborn. Still, the aftermath tangled with other realities. Legal filings moved forward while social curiosity brewed, and online commentary threatened distortion. Marcus prepared for a courtroom where interpretations and motives would be parsed and where Vanessa's narrative might attempt to recast cruelty as misunderstanding. He coordinated with counsel and advocacy groups, ensuring the children's voices would not be lost in procedural noise. As nights passed, he lay awake grappling with frames of regret. Times he had prioritized transactions over presence, delegating parenting to convenience until neglect gained footholds. That pain became a driver rather than an indulgence. He changed his calendar, canceled trips, and restructured his life around the small, ordinary demands of family. Slow gestures kept arriving in unexpected forms. Nia, after a week that felt both long and compressed by legal steps, slid a drawing across a small table, a crooked house with 3 figures and a sun scribbled in the corner. Beside it, she had written in lopsided letters, "Thank you." Marcus folded the paper into his wallet like a talisman. When Miss Thompson closed her file for the day, she left a number and clear instructions. "Call immediately if anything altered." Marcus committed the digits to memory and treated the counsel as another instrument in the architecture of safety. The aftermath would not be a single conclusion, but a sequence of guarded choices, legal maneuvers balanced with tenderness. a life remade by attention, where earlier negligence had allowed harm to multiply. In the quiet that followed, amid locks and lists and late-night planning, Marcus promised himself relentless vigilance, daily presence, and patient listening, determined to make their home a place of safety, learning, and honest belonging. All morning broke with a fragile calm, but the world outside was anything but. Atlanta's skyline gleamed, yet Marcus felt the pressure of unseen eyes closing in like a slow tide. By noon, the feeds erupted. Langston scandal, billionaire favors adopted black daughter over stepson. Anonymous accounts surfaced and spun a version that flattened nuance into outrage. Sources whispered accusations that read less like fact and more like a sharpened blade. Nia watched a blurred thumbnail on a tablet and dropped it, breath catching as the headline folded around her small frame. "Is this my fault?" she asked, voice thin and trembling. Marcus closed the screen with a careful motion, palms steady though pulse quick. "No," he said, voice low. "They are twisting the truth." He moved through channels with deliberate speed, calling the one journalist he trusted to handle children with empathy rather than spectacle. Rachel Miles arrived the next day, composed and respectful, cameras set to listen rather than hunt. On the patio, she asked simple questions in a cadence that eased the edges of confusion. "What's your favorite thing?" she asked gently. "Crayons," Nia answered without hesitation. "I draw to feel safe." "When did you stop feeling safe?" Rachel asked, and the little voice supplied the answer without flourish. "When Vanessa came," she said, "I was a symbol, not family." The microphone caught that small, fierce truth, and the crew kept the framing intimate so the moment stayed human and not performative. Marcus spoke after, not to commandeer the narrative, but to anchor it. "Nia didn't save me," he said plainly. "She showed me what family requires. This is not about race. This is about protecting a child." The clip posted and traveled fast, a contagion of clarity against a background of rumor. For a while, kindness arrived, messages offering support, small donations toward therapy, and strangers writing that they believed the girl and commended her courage. Nia read words aloud in a whisper, feeling each sentence like a buoy in a storm. Then counterclaims rippled. Allies of Vanessa mobilized online, alleging emotional distress and painting her as a parent wronged by circumstance. Anonymous pundits spun theories about motive and money. A late-night host suggested a narrative of manipulation. Marcus tightened security quietly, upgraded locks, revised visitor protocols, and limited public exposure to controlled moments where children felt safe and not displayed. His legal team drafted calm statements that pushed back against falsehood without igniting further spectacle, preferring methodical demonstration of facts over reactive rhetoric. An op-ed in a local paper argued that the scandal revealed how quickly the public weaponizes race and wealth into tidy judgments, prompting a national column inviting deeper conversation about privilege and responsibility. Marcus accepted a measured sit-down but insisted Nia remain shielded from forceful interrogation. He wanted journalism that asks rather than assaulted. The interviews shifted some discourse. Commentators debated duty and the particular vulnerability of children adopted into public life. Small practical responses proved the most sustaining. Teachers checked in with quiet care. A school counselor arranged sessions. Neighbors brought food and left notes reading, "We are here." Marcus used those gestures to rebuild ordinary rhythms. Library trips, homework at regular times, unremarkable dinners so children could feel the durable pattern of life beyond headlines. Meanwhile, the digital rumor mill churned. A podcaster with a broad following speculated about hidden resentments. A freelance investigator circulated old allegations about Marcus's past business disputes. Marcus and counsel monitored fragments but refused to chase every crooked thread. Instead, they curated an orderly record: camera clips, medical notes, timestamps, witness statements that could withstand scrutiny. Medical exams later documented injuries consistent with Nia's account and strengthened the protective case. Evidence and empathy together made dismantling lies less feasible. Nia navigated an odd interior landscape. Sometimes she drew houses kinder than the rooms she remembered, producing pictures with bright suns and three figures holding hands. Other days she refused to watch coverage and asked the television be turned off. Marcus let her choose, explaining context when she sought it and honoring silence when she needed it. As the weeks moved, the loud frenzy softened into persistent background noise. Legal motions were filed, statements exchanged, and the family braced for hearings while advocacy groups offered resources that had not been available before the story broke. Public attention had been messy, but it generated protection, connections to therapists, child advocates, and community allies who remained engaged. Marcus restructured life to prevent absence from creating new vulnerability. He canceled distant trips, attended recitals, prioritized school conferences, and required staff to focus on children's well-being rather than the glossy optics of their household. He learned to let fewer things compete for his attention and to be present in ways that were not performative. Over time, acts that seemed small, reading until eyelids drooped, packing lunches, asking about a school project, accreted into a new trust. Not all commentary receded. Some voices continued to argue, and the narrative fractured into competing timelines. Yet at home, routines began to reassert themselves, and neighbors' kindness stitched quieter seams. Months later, after hearings and statements, after counseling appointments and community meetings, a young woman who had seen Nia's drawings slipped an envelope onto their porch. Inside were a note and a small box of crayons labeled with hopeful messages. Nia opened the box with careful fingers and smiled, a small private victory beyond metrics and headlines. Marcus watched and felt relief that had little to do with vindication and everything to do with ordinary days' return. The story did not resolve with a single viral clip, but with a sequence of quieter reckonings, legal calendars, advocacy check-ins, and steady routines that prioritized consistency over sensation. Public opinion would continue to bend and reform, but the family would be rebuilt on practices more durable than outrage. In the hush between hearings and headlines, Marcus learned that truth rarely lives in one moment. It accumulates through repeated attention, honest apologies, and the patient work of showing up. He vowed to be present, accountable, and protective, and steady, humble actions would outlast the loudest, fleeting accusations always. Vanessa did not fade into silence. Within a week, official papers arrived. A forceful petition demanding visitation with Jamal and alleging parental alienation, a claim dressed up in legal phrasing meant to reopen access to a child. Marcus had shielded. Her lawyer offered a narrative of contrition, a rehearsed portrait of a mother who had seen her errors and wanted to reconcile, but Marcus refused to let polished rhetoric obscure a pattern he had watched unfold in private. He met with Samuel Wright and mapped a careful response. Compile every time-stamped clip, gather medical notes, secure therapist summaries, obtain school records, and prepare Nia for testimony in a way that protected her voice while preserving truth. The courtroom that convened for a family matter felt both ordinary and monumental. Judges in such rooms do not seek spectacle. They weigh corroboration, consistency, and the welfare calculus of vulnerable lives. Vanessa arrived surrounded by sympathetic counsel who urged empathy and second chances. Marcus sat with a quiet intensity, folder heavy in his lap, aware of how absence had permitted harm and determined to convert remorse into durable protection. When Nia took the small chair reserved for children, she spoke with a clarity that surprised those who expected trembling evasion. She described closed doors and sharp words, nights of withheld comfort and humiliating taunts that cut deeper than any physical mark. Her answers were economical and plain, each phrase a small, firm brick in a wall of testimony that refused to be rearranged by charm. Samuel presented video evidence that matched her account, frames showing a slammed closet door, a voice issuing orders, a hand that guided and then denied food, while a pediatric clinician testified to injuries and behavioral signs consistent with chronic stress. Vanessa's counsel argued rehabilitation and the importance of preserving parental bonds, insisting that an isolated incident did not warrant permanent estrangement. But the assembled documentation suggested a repeated pattern rather than a one-off lapse. The judge listened, asked precise questions, and weighed competing accounts with the impartiality required of the bench. Family law operates on the premise that safety is paramount, and where evidence points to ongoing risk, remedies will be shaped accordingly. After careful deliberation, the ruling protected the children. Visitation would not be restored, restraining orders remained in place, and any future contact would require supervised conditions and a demonstrable record of sustained change. The decision landed with a legal finality that eased immediate danger but did not erase the emotional residue of months or years. Vanessa left the courtroom with a cool composure, her face unreadable, and Marcus felt an odd combination of vindication and reluctant sorrow. Vindication because documentation affirmed the children's experiences. Sorrow because prevention should have been his first instinct. Back at the house, he prioritized ordinary caretaking as a form of repair, consistent dinners, evening stories, school drop-offs, and the small rituals that build trust through repetition rather than rhetoric. Therapists began work with the children to process trauma and rebuild attachment. School counselors coordinated supportive plans, and advocates provided resources to navigate the months ahead. Yet legal orders could not eliminate every shadow. Days later, an unsigned envelope appeared beneath the door with 3 terse words that read like a fossilized threat. "You think it's done, Langston?" Marcus placed the note in a locked drawer and shared its contents only with Samuel and a close confidant. choosing discretion while increasing security measures. Neighbors who had once admired the mansion now offered practical kindness meals left on porches, teachers checking in with quiet concern, and grassroots support proved more sustaining than headlines. Marcus reorganized his calendar, canceled distant trips, and restructured responsibilities so that absence could no longer be used as an excuse. His work life narrowed until home became less a set of obligations and more the priority it should have always been. Healing arrived not as a single wave but as many small tides. A drawing Nia slipped across a table with a crooked sun, Jamal's laugh returning in sudden bursts that surprised the house, and a slow rebuilding of trust in evening routines that signaled safety more effectively than any statement. The legal victory provided immediate protection and established an evidentiary foundation that would make future petitions harder to mount without verifiable rehabilitation. Yet Marcus knew vigilance had to continue. He met regularly with counsel, maintained documentation, and engaged with child advocates to ensure the protective architecture remained robust. Through hearings and filings, he learned an uncomfortable truth about accountability. Legal remedies can restrict contact but cannot by themselves restore innocence or time lost. Restoration demanded consistent presence, patient listening, and the willingness to confront personal failings without flinching. The family's public story attracted commentary. Some voices praised Marcus's action. Others questioned motives or parsed optics. But within the walls of their home, the work was quieter and more ordinary, made of nightly check-ins, gentle reminders that feelings could be named, and an insistence that small acts of care accumulate into safety. When asked later whether the ordeal had changed him, Marcus would speak of renewed priorities, of how a single moment of recognition had redirected his life toward accountability and presence, and of how the children's courage reframed his obligations beyond inheritance or reputation into the everyday practice of being available. The case would remain a chapter in public files in memory, sometimes resurfacing in furtive mentions or anonymous notes, but the ruling and the subsequent safeguards ensured that the immediate danger had been addressed. Shadows might linger at the edges as threats sometimes do, yet the household recalibrated around a different axis. One defined less by image and more by responsibility, less by convenience and more by continuous deliberate care that promised to hold the children safe into the uncertain days ahead. Naya's questions grew sharper, and a single breakfast changed the rhythm of their days. She pushed a plate of pancakes toward Marcus and asked, "Do you know my first parents?" The sentence was small and enormous. Sunlight pooled on the tabletop and the question hung like a bell. Marcus felt the paperwork's cold edge in his mind. Sealed records, a hospital name in Birmingham without names, but he set his fork down and met her eyes. "I'll try to find out," he said, the answer steady because a child had asked and steadiness felt necessary. He hired an investigator who worked with quiet efficiency, pulling hospital logs, patient indexes, and archived intake forms. The search felt clinical and tender at once. Clinical because it relied on documents and timestamps. Tender because each new discovery might redefine a child's sense of belonging. Weeks of waiting threaded through their days. Marcus answered Naya's small questions with as much honesty as he could, explaining that finding someone does not always mean everything will change, and that some truths arrive like fragile glass that must be handled slowly. When the file finally arrived, it was a folded thing with a name, Leona Marie Carter, living in Decatur and working nights at a diner. Marcus read the name aloud and felt a sudden tempering of distance. An adult name transformed into a possible human presence. Naya wanted to meet immediately. She said she had dreamed of a woman singing and wanted to know why that voice had left her cradle. The investigator arranged contact with discretion. Marcus called Leona and asked that she come to a cafe for a brief conversation. They arrived with a subdued choreography of pauses and careful steps. Leona was nervous, movements delicate. When Naya approached the table, Leona rose instinctively. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room contracted to the space between two faces. Naya searched Leona for the source of the singing she remembered in dreams, and Leona searched Naya for echoes of a life she had forfeited. Leona spoke carefully, offering a small narrative that did not ask for absolution. She explained that she was very young when circumstances forced choices she could not fully understand at the time. "I thought you would have a better life," she said softly. "I thought distance would protect you." Her voice broke on the last word and Naya reached out to touch a hand that ordinary contact, holding more gravity than every legal filing Marcus had amassed. There were no sweeping promises. Leona confessed to mistakes and offered fragile contrition. She produced a photograph from a folded wallet, grainy but genuine, of herself at 19, standing in front of a diner booth. Naya took the photo and held it as if it were a map. She asked small questions about songs, food, and why the woman had stopped singing sometime. Leona answered with the blunt practicality of someone who had learned to prioritize survival, long shifts, fear, lack of support. Her explanation was stark, admitting to absence without softening the logic that had guided her choice. Afterward, Marcus drove them home in silence, threaded with relief and careful wonder. He felt both gratitude for the meeting and a new responsibility. Knowledge does not erase absence, but it reshapes the landscape. Over the next weeks, they set boundaries for contact. Letters at first, short calls that Leona timed to end before fatigue could fray intentions, and occasional supervised meetings that prioritized Naya's emotional response. Marcus insisted that every step be paced by the child's comfort rather than adult urgency. Leona began a cautious program of steady change. She enrolled in evening classes to earn more stable hours, and she joined a support group that helped her navigate parentage and regret. She wrote simple notes to Naya, sentences that read like fragments of a life reassembled, sharing a recipe, a memory of a grandmother's quilt, a small joke about the diner's stubborn coffee. Marcus monitored the exchange but did not dominate it. He wanted Naya to determine the degree of intimacy she wanted. At school, Naya brought drawings of houses with bright suns and 3 stick figures holding hands. Sometimes she hummed a melody that matched the fragments she remembered in dreams, and during quiet nights she placed the photograph of Leona by her pillow. The photograph became a talisman rather than a contract. It answered a question without demanding a complete rewriting of her life story. Marcus watched these small choices and noted the subtle healing that took place when a child's curiosity was met with deliberate care. The fragile new relationship had setback. Once Leona missed a scheduled call because her shift ran late, and Naya retreated into silence for a day, raw and unsettled. Marcus used the moment to teach how hurt could be named and contained. They sat together, named the feeling, and planned a small reassurance, a letter and a drawing to send. Over time, such micro-negotiations taught Naya that uncertainty could be managed without catastrophe. There were moments of unexpected tenderness. Leona attended a school recital and clapped from the end of a row, eyes bright and occasionally wet. She brought a jar of homemade jam to a community bake sale and watched Naya distribute cookies with a proud smile. Marcus noticed when Naya offered a spontaneous hug at the grocery store, and he let himself feel the cautious joy of small, hard-won trust. Marcus also learned to accept that belonging does not erase the past. He kept records and supported Naya's therapy sessions while also encouraging autonomy. He taught her how to ask questions directly, how to set boundaries, and how to keep a thread of her own narrative intact. He counseled Leona about patience and consistency, and negotiated reasonable expectations for contact that centered on the child's well-being. As months passed, the presence of Leona became a series of quiet markings on Naya's map: a birthday card, a voice message saved in a folder, an occasional photograph from the diner. She did not step into the role of mother in the conventional sense, but she became a known figure whose existence answered a long-standing hunger for identity. For Marcus, the discovery catalyzed a renewed commitment. He would not allow distance to create neglect again. He rearranged priorities, attended school events, and carved time from his work to inhabit the ordinary obligations of parenting. In the end, the search for roots offered neither a tidy reunion nor a perfect remedy. It provided instead a human face to the music of Naya's dreams, a handful of shared moments, and the quiet knowledge that origin stories can be messy, imperfect, and still meaningful. Naya learned to hold both histories, her beginning and her present, without collapsing either, and Marcus learned that parenting sometimes requires vigilance, humility, and the willingness to let a child shape how much of the past she carries. They carried those days forward with cautious, hopeful intent. Winter arrived, and with it an uneasy hush. Snow softening edges while tension tightened like wire along the estate perimeter. Footprints appeared at dawn near the main gate, large, irregular impressions that did not belong to children, and Marcus examined them beneath the porch light. Feeling certainty retreat, he summoned the security team and ordered a sweep, insisting on measures that left no blind spots. Cameras were repositioned, motion sensors calibrated, and patrols adjusted to remove gaps. Technology, Marcus knew, could not erase fear, but it could make the house a less hospitable place for threats. Despite technical fixes, unease persisted inside the walls. Nights were quieter in ways that felt wrong. Jamal asked about strangers he imagined on the path, and Nia moved through rooms with a careful economy, as if minimizing her presence might keep trouble at bay. Marcus answered practical questions with a steady ritual: consistent dinners, the same bedtime story each night, a lamp left on in the hall to reweave trust through repetition. He understood that presence, not statements, would rebuild the rhythms that absence had once unraveled. The unease hardened when a crumpled wallet turned up in Nia's school locker. Inside was an identification card bearing the name James Carter and a grainy photograph of a man whose face carried both hardness and fatigue. Teachers shared the discovery with faculty quietly, and Marcus called Detective Lena at once. Lena's checks traced James to a recent release from a Birmingham correctional facility. She confirmed he had been associated with Leona years earlier and advised extreme caution. The detective recommended a controlled approach, background verification, arranged logistics, and a neutral public space for an initial meeting. Marcus called Nia into the sitting room and showed her the ID with a calm he forced on himself. He explained what an identification card could mean and how a name could carry stories a child did not have to inherit. "He might be your father," he said slowly, letting the sentence land. Nia took the information with a practical curiosity rather than a theatrical reaction. She asked where he worked and whether he had family, testing data like someone assembling pieces of a puzzle. They arranged a meeting at a community center chosen for its anonymity and safety. An officer stationed nearby but out of sight, another adult in the room to observe without intruding, and a reserved table that felt neither institutional nor intimate. James arrived with the cautious gait of a man reacquainting himself with ordinary life. Hair threaded with gray, shoulders carrying a ledger of time spent in places that do not encourage softness. He sat and let the moments settle around him. James spoke in blunt, unadorned fragments. "I hurt people," he said, voice low and steady. "I did things I regret and I paid for them." He described cycles that had led him into trouble, poor choices amplified by circumstance, lack of steady support, doors that closed when help was needed. He did not seek immediate forgiveness. Instead, he offered evidence of efforts to change program certificates, letters from a caseworker, and steady employment that suggested a new rhythm in his days. Nia observed him with an uncommon directness. She asked about absence and whether he remembered a song that sometimes surfaced in her dreams. She wanted practical facts, not grand declarations. James answered plainly: long shifts at a community kitchen, counseling sessions, and attendance at a reintegration group. He produced a dated certificate and a typed note from a counselor detailing steps taken since release. The materiality of those documents mattered, proof of action rather than promises. At one point, James lowered his head and acknowledged harm without deflection. "There are things I cannot take back," he admitted, fingers worrying the seam of his jacket. "But I can try to be different now." The candor landed as an offer rather than a demand. Nia listened, then said with a clarity that surprised the adults, "Don't let your worst be all people know." Her sentence functioned as a boundary and a possibility at once, naming accountability while leaving the door open to careful change. The meeting produced no cinematic reconciliation. It produced instead arrangements designed around Nia's well-being, supervised visits only if a consistent pattern of stability could be demonstrated, letters exchanged under guidance, and therapy scheduled to support Nia's processing of each step. Marcus and Lena insisted that future contact be measured and demonstrable rather than declarative. Progress would be evidenced by sustained behavior, not only words. Back home, Marcus balanced further security upgrades with efforts to preserve ordinary rhythms, so the children's lives would not be defined only by protective measures. He notified school counselors and arranged flexible pickup plans, while requesting neighbors to watch for unfamiliar vehicles. Practical kindness around the block, dinners left on doorsteps, a neighbor offering to walk a dog briefly softened isolation. Marcus instructed counsel to maintain privacy, resisting the temptation to let the matter expand into a public story that might re-traumatize a child. Community response varied. Some neighbors offered quiet support, others supplied gossip that Marcus filtered out, and a reporter's query was met with a carefully worded refusal designed to protect the children. Detective Lena cautioned that people with criminal histories sometimes carried complicated motives and that vigilance needed to be steady, but not frenetic. Marcus accepted that protective architecture required both boundary and patience. Nia's drawings began to change subtly. Where she had once sketched solitary houses, she now added a small figure at the edge of a yard, visible but not embraced, shaded differently to mark distance and possibility. Marcus pinned one of those pictures to the refrigerator and saw in it a micro-evidence of safety. Reconnection could be held without full surrender, a shape of curiosity rather than surrendering attachment. James attended supervised group sessions focused on accountability and reintegration. He sent occasional notes and a photograph of a small plant he was tending as a symbol of care. Nia received these items with cautious interest, sometimes talking about them aloud, sometimes tucking them into a keepsake box beside school awards. Marcus checked in regularly with therapists to calibrate expectations and to ensure each interaction honored Nia's pace. Over the months, the initial alarm softened into a guarded rhythm. Supervised meetings occurred under professional oversight. Letters went back and forth with review, and the detective monitored for any signs that contact became unsafe. The presence of a possible father complicated the family's narrative, but also allowed Nia to define what connection would mean for her. Marcus learned that discovering roots need not erase present safety. Origins could be explored while preserving the care he now prioritized. Shadows lingered as they often do, but they no longer stalked the household unchecked. Security protocols remained not as instruments of paranoia but as an architecture of protection. Marcus taught the children language to name fears and tools to navigate them, ensuring empowerment rather than entrapment. Small joys began to reappear. The deliberate launch of a snowball in the yard, Jamal's sudden burst of laughter, Nia's quiet hum as she colored in those moments felt like fragile respites and more like a reclaiming of ordinary light. Marcus accepted that safety required sustained effort and that vigilance must be both practical and patient. He kept records, maintained contact with advocates, and learned to watch without suffocating. In that balance, the family found not perfect healing but steady, chosen safety ultimately. Spring arrived and sunlight warmed rooms that had been cautious for months. Netu announced one morning at the kitchen table, "I want my name to be Netu Marie Langston." The sentence landed like permission. Marcus felt relief and a fierce resolve to make the change meaningful. They went to court together on a bright day. The building smelled of old varnish and polished brass, and procedural motions moved steadily. Forms, signatures, witnesses. Netu signed with a hand that trembled only briefly, then steadied as if the act itself gave shape to a truth she had held inside. The judge smiled kindly when the decree was read. "This is who I am," Netu said quietly, voice sure. The formal recognition felt less like a trophy and more like a settled fact. Afterward, they celebrated in a way that felt ordinary and honest. Ice cream from a small shop down the block. Jamal smeared chocolate on his chin, and Marcus laughed. The sound uncomplicated by agenda. The small ritual mattered. Normal was a currency they had been earning, but resolution was not absolute. Weeks later, Vanessa filed a petition seeking relief from a restraining order, claiming sobriety and a desire to reconnect. The filing landed like a reminder that legal endings often involve new beginnings for those who insist on them. Marcus and his counsel prepared, careful to shield the children from exposure, while ensuring the court process would reflect verified changes, not performative gestures. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse waited as if holding its breath. Vanessa arrived composed and clean. Her attorney framed the petition with language of rehabilitation and family unity. Marcus watched, tensing when rote performances threatened to rewrite harm as misunderstanding. He had learned that courts prize documentation, timestamps, medical records, consistent testimony. Their attorney presented corroborating evidence and behavioral reports while therapists described Necho's needs and the child's necessary supports. Necho spoke with a reserve that combined fearlessness and fatigue. "I forgive her," she said, meeting the judge's gaze, "but I want peace more than her apology." The statement was not a show of magnanimity, but a boundary expressed with compassion. The judge weighed evidence and testimony, then issued a ruling that refused unsupervised visitation, upheld the restraining order, and required any further contact to be supervised and predicated on sustained, verifiable change. Back at home, Nichos placed the court paper in a small box she kept beside her bed, labeled in a child's careful hand. "For me," she told Marcus plainly, "this is for me, not her." The act transformed legal text into a talisman of ownership. Daily life resumed with small acts that rebuilt trust. Consistent meal times, bedtime stories, and school drop-offs performed without interruption. Marcus traded travel days for school recitals. Presence itself became a pledge. Practicalities continued. Counsel monitored filings. Security remained vigilant, and therapists worked with the children to name emotions and practice boundaries. Community allies offered support. Neighbors left dinner. Teachers adjusted classroom plans, and a local counselor set up an art group that allowed Necho channel memory into creation. Social media churned in sporadic bursts, sometimes dredging up old rumors, but the household prioritized private stability over public debate. Necho's memory box grew with careful artifacts: a pressed flower, a ticket stub, a photograph of Leona taken at a cafe. Each item tracked steps rather than erased histories. Leona's letters arrived in neat envelopes, soft with regret and small accounts of change. Meetings with supervised contact were paced and predictable. Marcus insisted on structure so Nichos could negotiate intimacy on her own terms. Neighborhood life stitched itself back into place. Children played under watchful but relaxed eyes, and the family learned to accept invitations that anchored them to routine. Little rituals: the Saturday library run, Jamal's soccer practice, a shared pancake breakfast, Mended ordinary rhythm. Marcus found that repeated attention accomplished repair more reliably than any single dramatic gesture. Occasional setbacks appeared, an unsigned note, a social post designed to provoke, a rumor from someone who wanted attention. These disturbances were managed with measured responses, documentation forwarded to council, additional patrols around the perimeter, and reminders to the children that their safety plan remained in effect. Marcus kept records and maintained a wary calm. Vigilance, he realized, required both restraint and responsiveness. Healing took place in tiny increments. Nicho drew houses in which figures stood together yet retained space between them. She hummed tunes instead of replaying fear. Jamal's laughter returned in spontaneous bursts that felt like tiny victories. Therapy sessions taught tools for naming feelings and setting boundaries. Marcus participated, learning to ask better questions and to accept answers that prioritized the children's needs over public image. The legal decision provided protection but could not conjure instantaneous peace. The family rebuilt around steady practices, transparency with caregivers, documented interactions, and limits that honored Nicho's pace. When community groups offered opportunities to share their experience, Marcus accepted selectively, preferring forums that channeled resources to foster care and counseling rather than spectacle. One spring evening, they marked a small milestone, a backyard pizza and a cake with a reluctant candle. Nichos closed her eyes and made a wish that was private and small. Marcus watched and felt the weight of responsibility shift towards something softer, care that did not rely on headlines, but on repetition of ordinary kindness. He promised himself to keep time for the children, to answer when they knocked, and to rewrite priorities to reflect daily devotion. As months passed, the household weathered rumors and quiet reminders of past threats, but routines held. Security persisted, not as paranoia but as an architecture of safety. Marcus learned that restoration required patience and the humility to remain present. Nicho's choice to claim a name served not only as a legal act, but as an invitation to define herself on terms she could control. The family's future did not promise flawlessness, but it did promise a steadier horizon, one shaped by deliberate care, careful and persistent attention. Marcus directed resources toward practical change, launching a small initiative with Nicho's consent that funded counseling scholarships, provided school essentials, and arranged steady mentorships for foster youth. Volunteers led after-school workshops in writing and art so children could name feelings and shape stories. Therapists offered accessible sessions and caregiver groups taught boundary skills and routine building. Leona and James joined contact under strict supervision, each meeting paced by professional guidance and centered on the child's comfort. They exchanged letters, attended joint sessions with counselors, and appeared at supervised events where nature could observe without pressure. Small gestures, handwritten notes, a photograph from a cafe, a jar of jam arrived and were received with caution. Nichos learned to accept gestures on her terms, practicing both gratitude and refusal, and Marcus made room for her choices, adjusting routines to reflect needs rather than assumptions. Months of patient work yielded subtle but meaningful shifts. Jamal's laughter returned with less hesitation, neighbors resumed shared block gatherings, and ordinary routines. Library visits, weekend pancakes, homework at a steady hour reclaimed their power. The family did not pretend wounds vanished overnight, yet they discovered that steady presence, careful boundaries, and community care stitched a more durable shelter around them. They built a life threaded with care, gradual trust, and the small courage of presence every day. Summer arrived in waves of heat and color, and the neighborhood seemed to inhale the season with a collective, easy exhale. Number enrolled in a youth writing camp that met in a sunlit community center, where folding chairs circled like an audience waiting for truth. She carried a small notebook into that room and filled its pages with sentences that shaped the days she had lived and the days she wanted to build. At first, she wrote about small things: pancakes on quiet mornings, Jamal's laugh that popped up like a surprise, the hush of night that let thoughts breathe. Then she found a voice that wanted to name harder things as well. Her teachers noticed a steadiness in the way she arranged details and offered prompts that asked for more than memory. The prompts asked for meaning. She read aloud at the camp's open mic and watched how expression altered the room's stiff shoulders loosened. Strangers wiped their eyes and applause arrived like the steady beat of an encouraging heartbeat. Her stories threaded pain and recovery without turning either into spectacle. She wrote of the closet door and the wooden spoon, but she also wrote about crayons pressed into small hands and a father who learned to sit at a table and listen. Each line became an offering, a small map toward compassion rather than retribution. At the final reading, Naya stood and took the microphone with a confidence that had been earned in small doses, practice that felt more like patience than sudden bravery. She looked at faces in the room and spoke plainly, My story is not the same as what hurt me. The wound exists, but it is not a definition. What matters is the next chapter and what I choose to do with the break. The audience roared in a way that felt both public and private, like applause that belonged to everyone who ever found language for a wound. After the event, she held a handmade sheet where people had written notes, names of teachers and kindnesses, and she added words of thanks to the list, tucking a tiny drawing in the margin that made someone smile. Back home, Naya painted a wall in the playroom where she and Jamal left fingerprints in bright colors. The mural became a ledger of gratitude and small histories. She painted names with deliberate strokes. Miss Thompson for steady listening, Arab for offering a camera that asked to witness, not exploit, Samuel for fighting in halls that smelled of varnish, Jamal for laughter that returned like a bell, Marcus for showing up late and deciding to stay, and then her own name in larger letters. Naya Marie Langston. Below she wrote another sentence in looping letters, a quiet proclamation, still becoming me. The mural settled into the house as a performed memory, a record of people who had been present when presence mattered most. Marcus launched the Naya project with a practical clarity that reflected his business instincts, converted into compassion. Funds were allocated to counseling services, safe housing for children who were leaving harmful homes, and workshops that taught narrative skills and emotional literacy. He partnered with local nonprofits, schools, and counselors, insisting on accountability and measurable outcomes, while also creating space for small gestures that conveyed care. Naya appeared at a few launches, not for speeches but to press hands on envelopes with therapist names and to sign booklets that would go to other kids who needed words. Her silence in public often said more than any statement. People watched and learned that activism could be quiet and effective, rather than performative. The project seeded scholarships for creative writing camps and funded legal clinics that helped guardians navigate protective orders and custody hearings without predatory counsel or public spectacle. It generated mentors who could spend time with children doing homework, reading aloud, and practicing assertion, transforming lonely afternoons into supported hours filled with options. Small wins accrued. A child who had been withdrawn found a short story she loved and read it to a class. Another presented a drawing that asked less for rescue and more for recognition. Community volunteers organized drives for school supplies and book donations, and the Naya project matched vulnerable children with counselors who offered sliding fees and flexible scheduling. Local reporters covered the initiative with a focus on impact rather than scandal, and the narrative around Naya grew beyond sensation into sustained social investment. At home, Naya continued to write and sometimes left stacks of pages on the kitchen counter where Marcus would find them and read with a quiet pride that looked less like ownership and more like stewardship. Jamal developed a new habit of tucking folded notes into Naya's backpack. Small sketches, a list of things that made him laugh, a crude map of secret forts built in the yard. The family navigated birthdays, school recitals, and ordinary storms with the sense that ordinary was slowly regaining its rightful place in life. Naya learned to say no when she needed distance and to accept apologies without surrendering boundaries, practicing the delicate work of keeping both compassion and protection in view. She met Leona and James in supervised contexts that prioritized her comfort. The meetings were often stilted and ordinary, sometimes awkward and occasionally warm. Those meetings taught Naya the difference between longing and necessity, showing her that reunion could be cautious without being cruel. She placed a photograph of Leona in a small frame and set it among other objects on a nightstand as both an answer to a question and a reminder that origin did not dictate destiny. Summer deepened into a sequence of lazy afternoons and deliberate commitments, writing workshops, garden care funded by the project, and evening walks that became regular ritual. Naya's public words began to form a small body of work, essays, short pieces, a modest anthology collected by the project, and those texts found readers who responded with letters of solidarity and shared experience. Schools used her pieces to teach empathy in literature classes, and counselors recommended readings that included her voice as a model for resilience, expressed through art. People arrived at community events bringing small gifts, jars of jam, handmade bookmarks, notes that read, "We see." These gestures stitched social fabric in ways that headlines could not. At the final project fundraiser, Marcus watched children sit at tables with crayons and notebooks, and felt a satisfaction rooted in service rather than reputation. Naya, watching from a short distance, drew quietly and occasionally leaned toward a neighbor with a grin that signaled trust more than obligation. The project published impact reports showing hours of counseling, numbers of children served, and follow-up metrics that guided future funding and policy, ensuring that the effort would not collapse when attention waned. Legal advocacy groups used the model to propose similar programs in neighboring districts, and asked Marcus to consult on sustainable funding that matched measurable outcomes. Meanwhile, Naya kept a small box of artifacts that she called her memory chest: a pressed leaf, a ticket stub from the ice cream shop, a picture of a crooked house, handwritten notes from friends, and a photo of Marcus reading aloud. She wrote in the margins of pages she drafted, crossing phrases and adding small clarifications, learning that revision is a form of survival and a practice of self-ownership. The mural in the playroom gained new signatures as neighbors, volunteers, teachers, and even children from the writing camp added marks. The wall documented an emergent community rather than a static triumph. As months turned into a year, the household measured progress in rhythms more than in milestones: consistent bedtimes, a calendar filled with recitals and library visits, dinners that ended without tension, and the quiet ritual of checking each other. Naya's voice changed too, from a brittle clarity to a steadier, reflective tone that honored complexity without dissolving accountability. She shared a short piece in an online magazine about names and belonging that gathered comments from readers who wrote about their own journeys and thanked her for naming naughty feelings plainly. Marcus remained watchful, maintaining security measures and legal safekeeping while learning to let ordinary trust take root in small, persistent gestures. At night, they gathered, sometimes on the back stoop, to watch the sky and count soft constellations, and Naya learned to wish privately and fiercely for a future she could write herself. The Naya project continued to grow in careful ways, responsive to community needs, and guided by the principle that care must be accessible, sustained, and accountable. When viewers asked how they could help, the call to action was simple: donate, volunteer, listen without judgment, and share resources rather than spectacle. Naya often closed public readings with a line she had revised many times: "I am not what harmed me, I am what I choose to heal into." The crowd would hush and then break into applause that felt earned and soft. People left with a small sense of duty rather than voyeurism, and the city slowly learned to care with depth rather than headline speed. She taught other children to write truthfully and to shape narratives that made room for repair, and mentors used her pieces to guide conversations about consent, boundaries, and courage. Through project reports and quiet afternoons, the family tracked a slow accumulation of safety and meaning. It was not grand, but it was steady. At summer's close, Naya placed the final sheet of a new draft into a folder labeled "For Later" and smiled, folding her hands as if holding the future gently. She whispered to Marcus that night, "I'm not what hurt me, I'm what I healed." Share how it moved you, like and subscribe to join us in amplifying voices like Naya's.